Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on our webinar on the power of purple teaming. I'm Christian Scott, practice leader here at Plurilock. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about what purple teaming is, where traditional pen testing falls short, where purple teaming creates a real-time security advantage for organizations to understand their security posture beyond just conventional pen tests, how to start to implement certain purple teaming methodologies and tooling into your cybersecurity programs, as well as to improve the security, the organization's security posture through the lens of incident response. That being said, for today's session here, I'm going to be hosting us. And just a little bit about my background for your edification. So I'm Christian Scott, practice leader here at Plurilock. I lead our offensive cybersecurity practice when it comes to everything of the domain of penetration testing and social engineering testing, red teaming, and purple teaming. I come from a background of about 20 years of experience with about 3,000 different engagements under my own belt, emulating sophisticated adversaries with the intent of breaking into organizations and helping provide insights to blue teams on how to improve not just their security posture of the specific vulnerabilities and weaknesses that might exist, but more importantly, the underlying root causes of those vulnerabilities and weaknesses that might be part of the defense and death model of the business, as well as improving the efficacy of the incident response program. That being all noted, Plurilock here, we are a elite cybersecurity team that helps organizations across the domain of enterprises and governmental agencies with their cybersecurity initiatives in the domains of offensive cybersecurity, but also in the practice domains of zero trust and security operations and intellectual property protection. So with all that being staged out and set, I have my screen shared out here, and we're going to go through a little bit more about the power of purple teaming. So to set a frame of reference for everyone, purple teaming is not necessarily a new team that exists, right? A purple team is more of a construct, a framework in regards to the conventional model of a red team and a blue team, right? Organizations employ a red team or an offensive security team that emulates adversaries, right? Trying to break into the organization. And then once establishing a foothold, attempts things like lateral movement, maintaining persistence, and also continuing with privilege escalation all the way until they get to a certain point of a cascading compromise, right? In that process, the red team is going to identify various number of vulnerabilities and weaknesses that many of which maybe they've detected, but many of which they obviously exploited in their kill chain of gaining access to, confidential company data and information systems, so on and so forth. Then you have your blue team, right, which are the defenders, right? So that's your security operations center team, that's your hunt team, that's digital forensics and incident response. That might also involve your just general IT department, especially because a lot of folks will wear a lot of different hats. But it could also include some level of having security operations outsourced to things like a managed security services provider who is an MDR, right? That being said, there's this overlap between red teaming and purple teaming that exists, but the purple teaming is more about, rather than emulating an adversary with the intent of breaking into an organization with a specific an objective to accomplish, what about all the insights about the tactics, techniques, and procedures, and all the indicators of compromise or indicators of attack that may generate in that process? And what does the blue team see, right? So does the blue team see, as we're having the red team do something like, doing reconnaissance or open source intelligence gathering on the organization, and that it's moving from passive to active? Can we see those types of scans? Can we see them poking and prodding at systems, right? Do we see them, hitting one of our honeypots that might be deployed, right? So the blue team picking up that information, not just in a technical standpoint of, yes, that information gets ingested, maybe into a security information event management system, maybe into an underlying security operations center platform, right? But also, is that event being appropriately tagged as an alert that's noteworthy? Is it being graduated into an alert that's notifiable and actionable? Is someone from the Security Operations Center team actioning on that? As in, they see that there's some type of maybe really, really overtly aggressive vulnerability scanning or reconnaissance that's being done on a set of systems, right? And then blocking whatever the source malicious IP address was or subnet, right? So there's varying levels in which we can kind of test the efficacy of detecting, various indicators of attack and indicators of compromise and TTPs and all that kind of stuff. But then there's also how fast are we able to respond to those, right? So with our red team, right, we're emulating a threat actor, right? The interaction with the blue team is usually extremely limited. We're just kind of following through on a kill or trying to accomplish a kill chain, gaining a foothold into an organization, right? And then we're really just kind of assessing like how well did the blue team, prevent us from breaking into the system when it came to the initial defensive controls at the perimeter, that are also kind of buried a little bit, maybe more into the defense and depth posture of the organization, and how fast they kick us out of it, right? But the purple teaming approach, when we have the red team and the blue team be more collaborative in an engagement where we're emulating a threat actor, what that allows us to do is get more insights into metrics like, what was our mean time to detection, right? At what point of attempting to gain a foothold into a system or accomplishing a kill chain was that detected? Why was that maybe not detected sooner? Was it because it was, a lack of a technology facility picking up that event source? Or is it because that event was never graduated to the appropriate level of an alert? Or is it because the Security Operations Center didn't action on that alert in a timely manner? It really kind of focuses more on trying to also mature the incident response capabilities of the organization and of the team, right? So, concisely put, we're bridging those two teams together in a collaborative exercise, right? Where we have the defenders and the attackers, and we're emulating an adversary with the intent of breaking into the organization. We see what the red team does. We see how the blue team responds. We have basically a ledger of being able to track that in real time, right? And then we can then very specifically deduce, okay, this is where the blue team could have done better, right, in regards to being able to detect that threat earlier on and block that threat earlier on, so on and so forth, right? So red teaming in itself, emulating adversaries. Purple teaming is very different than conventional pen testing, right? So a lot of times, there's this kind of misconception that like traditional pen tests provide organizations an accurate insight into what their security posture looks like. But there's a couple of deficiencies with conventional penetration tests that organizations should be, aware of, which is, so first and foremost, just because somebody's conducting a pen test and, let's say that that's a pen test that's both external and internal network pen testing, that's only still focusing on the exploitation of technical vulnerabilities and weaknesses, right? In regards to, out of date, servers and infrastructure and unintentionally exposed administrative interfaces and all that type of stuff, right? But it's technical vulnerabilities and weaknesses. There's not a social engineering component combined to it, right? And social engineering testing, which is usually kind of combined together in your red teaming engagements, right, is very, very different than your end user security awareness training, right? Because end user security awareness training is not about sending a phishing email, or is not about understanding what a threat actor can really do if they gain a foothold into someone's, mailbox through an account takeover attack or business email compromise scenario, right? Your end user security awareness training is all about, okay, we sent out this phishing email to everyone. Did they click the link? If somebody clicked the link, assign them remedial training, right? So it's very, very much focused on the end user security awareness training component, right? So, your conventional things like, solutions like KnowBe4, it's not going to simulate accurately what would happen if a malicious actor got somebody to click an email, right? After clicking that email and going to the website and inputting their credentials, and a malicious actor bypassing, multi-factor authentication, what that truly looks like, right? Those are very, very different things. So your conventional technical penetration testing doesn't incorporate those elements. That's important to know, right? And then when you're truly emulating an adversary in a red teaming engagement and in a purple teaming engagement, you're incorporating, yes, phishing techniques, but that might be also phone calls. That might also be things like sending messages to people. That might include also things like calendar jacking. That might include social engineering someone's Microsoft Copilot agent that's reading, emails in someone's mailbox. So it's a zero-click email attack, right? It's those other aspects, right, that are through the human element that a malicious actor is then, or we're trying to emulate a malicious actor attempting to gain a foothold into the organization. And then once we bypass multi-factor authentication, we're in somebody's account, right? We've successfully accomplished an account takeover attack. We don't stop there, right? As emulating an adversary, we try to see what, from a lateral movement perspective, what other systems, what other type of data can we get access to, right? Or if we can get someone to execute a piece of our quote unquote malware or one of our payloads, right? Rather than just the person has clicked it and they've executed it, really, once we gain a foothold into their workstation, okay, well, how can we laterally move into other systems? Or, well, we just compromised the Citrix server. Okay, well, how can we dig in deeper, right? So there's an aspect of, again, to the regular phish testing, right, that's focused on end user security awareness. It's very surface level, right? While when we're doing true adversary emulation, right, we're incorporating those aspects. So we do the true adversary emulation, right, with the red team, right? And then we bring them together with our blue team, right? That's how we have these purple teaming kind of scenarios, right? There's also very frequently a lot of kind of misconceptions beyond the fact that, pen tests are not about, truly understanding the full security posture of an organization and how it stands up against an adversary, right? That's incorporating social engineering techniques as well. And the fact that also, pen tests, are not focusing on improving the incident response capabilities of the organizations. It's mostly focused on technical vulnerabilities and weaknesses that are observed and exploited, right? There's also a lot of tools out in the marketplace that people will say, oh, these tools simulate an accurate pen test or an accurate purple teaming scenario, right? That's not to say that these tools aren't great tools for what they specifically do in regards to like vulnerability scanning or attack surface management, but they're not purple teaming tools, right? And we're going to talk about in a couple of moments here some specific purple teaming tools that you can incorporate into your organization. All the ones that we're going to suggest here are open source tools, right? So, you don't have to worry about like, okay, what's the cost for going using this, that, or the other thing, right? Or that, this is sponsored by some, purple team tooling provider or SaaS provider, that kind of stuff. Really, we want to provide recommendations, right, that are practical for things that people can implement, very quickly within their organizations that don't introduce a lot of additional cost, right? Obviously, anytime someone goes to use an open source tool, you should make sure that you analyze it, take a look at it, make sure that, part of your change management process that you deploy it correctly and all that kind of stuff, right? But we have the tendency of, when we talk about getting started with a new construct of improving your security posture, start simple, start inexpensively, start with something that's kind of an open source tool that's going to help you out with that. So again, we're going to get into some tools that folks can incorporate as they're building a purple teaming practice within their organization. Now, there's really kind of two main domains of purple teaming exercises that can be conducted. So there's the manual adversary emulation, or we can do automated adversary emulation. Now, organizations that are more mature and that are kind of more aligned to like a DevOps or DevSecOps model, right? Where they may have specific products. It might be like web applications, mobile applications, APIs, that kind of stuff that need to be tested, right? They can incorporate some of these tools that we kind of have on screen here. And we're going to talk about more specifically down below, right? They can incorporate some of these tools to be essentially shoehorned into what we call the continuous integration, continuous deployment lifecycle, or part of the security software development lifecycle, right? Where we can do some type of atomic purple team testing, right? And get a result back. And that could be part of our essentially quality assurance process, right? Of, is that new piece of software that we're looking to deploy, did it pass the bare minimum checks of generating what seemed like indicators of compromise, indicators of attack, various TTPs, right? Was that picked up by our team and our tools? Okay, great, it was. Okay, pass on to the next part of the quality assurance process. And then there's the more manual adversary emulation tools that kind of exist out there. Again, a combination of open source tools and all that kind of stuff that folks can employ. That manual adversary emulation is better for like organization scale, full organization scale, rather than focusing on a specific product or a specific platform, right? Of emulating an adversary, trying to break into the organization, usually through more conventional attack vectors of focusing on staff members within the organization rather than like a specific product like web interface or mobile interface, that type of stuff, right? But nonetheless, what we like to do is we try to incorporate like a standard process for that, right? And so there is a framework that we're going to get into here in a moment for staging up purple teaming engagements, right? And purple teaming exercises, right? So the whole kind of point of a purple teaming exercise, right, is we really want to essentially, emulate an adversary that's going to be a realistic adversary that's going to target our organization, right? When we go to, emulate that adversary, we're going to have the red team and the blue team be collaborative in this process of essentially coming up with a plan of what's going to be done, when it's going to be done, having purple teaming sessions where they're exchanging information in real time as they're conducting some of these tests. So you can kind of imagine from uh, a high level perspective, somebody saying, hey, we're going to now attempt to perform this type of vulnerability scan, right? This overtly aggressive vulnerability scan on this system. Blue team, do you guys see anything come up in, let's say the SIM, I don't know, Rapid7 Insight IDR? Okay, yes, we saw that there was an event that came in. We saw that it got graduated up to an alert, but for some reason it wasn't a notification that went out to the rest of the SOC team to respond to and action on for one reason or another. Okay, well, why is that the case? Oh, it might be that we have to kind of, make an adjustment in Rapid7 Insight IDR. Or it might be that the playbooks that we have, right, might need to be updated for one reason or another, that type of stuff, right? So when we're kind of planning out these exercises, right, we want to have specific kind of, goals in mind, but those goals are typically going to be in alignment with, okay, how can we improve our incident response capabilities, throughout the entire life cycle, all the way from detection and identification, all the way through eradication, right? Or containment and eradication, right? And so, like I was noting, we have a framework for this. So the purple teaming exercise framework, right? PTEF, right? As a very well-known framework, right? And that framework essentially helps guide organizations in planning their purple teaming exercises, right? Getting the appropriate stakeholders from your red team and your blue team together, right? Making sure that they, are going to be focusing on the same system scope, the same locality scope with the same objectives, right? And then coordinating, setting up, each one of those meetings, right, in which the red team, the blue team are coordinating and collaborating together, right? So again, we're emulating an adversary, right? We're generating, some type of specific TTPs. Let's say we have another scenario where we're going through, rather than open source intelligence gathering and reconnaissance, we want to have post-compromise of an account takeover attack of an individual, right? So that's the starting point for the red team. Hey, let's generate some rules in the mailbox of a hypothetically compromised user of rerouting mail or redirecting mail to an outside mailbox in the outside of the organization. Okay, cool. So we have a compromised account, right, that the red team is in, right? They generate that rule, right, rerouting email to an outside mailbox, right? Does the blue team pick that up in their security information event management system or in the SOC system, right? Are they are do the beyond the points of contact that might be inclined and privy to this purple teaming engagement? Do the rest of the security operations center analysts, right, who don't know that this is going on, do they respond to it, right? You know, and that allows us to really kind of like understand again the efficacy of, you know, yes, we have information that's being technically ingested by the SIM and the SOC and all that kind of stuff. And yes, there's alerts and notifications, but you know, are our analysts picking that up appropriately and responding to that appropriately, right? And then if not, right, now we know where there's an area where we can go back and we can tune something, we can train the SOC, right? We can deploy better tooling, right? Detection capabilities, right? So that we can prevent the next time of that occurring. Classic example that I always like to use with folks is, you know, a lot of engagements, you know, militia or a lot of engagements, pen testers or red teaming folks, you know, they'll do some level of like broadcast name resolution poisoning with either NetBIOS or link local multicast name resolution, that type of stuff. And they'll poison essentially broadcast name resolution requests are on a particular subnet all the time, right? So someone might be looking for, you know, file server file server one, and doesn't resolve to the upstream DNS server for one reason or another, and they put out a NetBIOS request or a link local multicast name resolution request on the subnet, and it asks everyone, hey, does anyone know file server 01? And if you do, can you let me know the IP address? And the bad guy on that local subnet VLAN is like, yeah, I know that. That's me. That's my IP address, right? And this way they can, you know, masquerade as a file server. They can listen on any incoming traffic, and they'll very frequently ingest things like from like Windows file sharing services, like NTLM hashes of users that they can then crack or do a pass the hash attack on. So one element for a blue team to be able to detect that type of attack vector, especially because that exists between the domains of the OSI layer of like layers 2 and 3, is do we have something that is purposely putting out fake net BIOS and link local multicast name resolution requests onto that subnet and VLAN that do not exist, and seeing if there's a response? For example, if we had a listener, right, that just keeps saying, hey, does anyone know the name of baloney server? Baloney server is never going to exist, right? But if we get a response back from something on the local network or on that same subnet and VLAN that says, oh yeah, I know baloney server, that's my IP address, that's a that's a malicious actor, right? So that's an indicator of attack. That's a TTP, right? So what we can do is, now that the blue team has that capability of deploying out a system to detect NetBIOS and link local multicast name resolution poisoning attacks, now they can more efficiently, right, respond to a malicious actor who's earlier on in trying to accomplish a kill chain or gaining foothold into the environment, right? Because now we have that capability, that insight, right? And typically things like your NetBIOS name resolution, multicast name resolution, poisoning attacks, they're not going to be picked up like by a regular vulnerability scanner, right? So that's, you know, again, that's a direct extension of the blue team's capabilities, right? And their ability to detect a malicious actor early on. So I talked a little bit about doing exercises that can be manual, right? Where we're getting two teams together, right? And they're coordinating a set of scenarios that they're going to be collaborating on. You know, those might be compromise scenarios. Those might be post-compromise scenarios. Um, and they're trying to get, again, you know, insights into things like, you know, dwell time and having the ability to, you know, faster detect kind of what's going on and improve the incident response playbooks. But like also, we have autonomous, you know, purple teaming, right? Or kind of what I was talking about a little bit earlier on with automated or semi-automated purple teaming tools. One of them that I've talked quite a bit about in the past on some of our webinars is Meyer Caldera, and I'll dive more into that in a moment. But as another example, there are a lot of other great tools out there. So like Leonardus is a framework that a lot of folks will use for like AWS environments. It also now supports Kubernetes Docker environments. And so what we can essentially do is this would be for organizations that are more mature from like a product standpoint and having like practicing DevOps, DevSecOps, and that kind of stuff, and they can, instantiate configurations like as like infrastructure as code. Essentially, what we can do is we can define purple teaming exercises, right? Or purple team tests, right? In code, right? So we can essentially in code define a new TTP, right? And that new TTP is going to go through the continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline every single time we're kind of like uh, pushing out a new major release of the application, right? Now, this testing that's occurring as we're defining the new TTP, right, and what the attack's going to be, but we're also having a mechanism to determine was that executed attack or TTP, was it successful? Like, did it leave an artifact on like the file system of like a server or something like that, right? But nonetheless, so when we go to define that and it goes through a automated or semi-automated purple team test, right, and it executes that attack against an AWS environment, it might simulate like a compromised S3 bucket, right? Or it might simulate a compromised AWS user that had poorly defined IAM permissions or an overly permissible API key that got exploited by a malicious actor who's now spinning up a new EC2 instance or something like that. And then we can check to see like, well, did like guard duty in AWS, which is the typical go-to for a lot of organizations that have AWS, did guard duty detect those TTPs and alert our team? And did that ship the logs to our SIM and our SOC team for them to see what's kind of going on, or did it not even get seen by guard duty in the first place? Ergo, there was no logs to ship even into the company centralized SIM, right? So again, both approaches are equally valid approaches. It's going to be based on what the type of organization you're dealing with is, if it's a business to consumer or if it's a business to business organization, right? If it's a software or if it's like a software as a service type of organization that's practicing a lot more principles like DevOps and DevSecOps, or is it a more conventional organization that may do some level of in-house software development, but it's not necessarily nearly as heavy, right? And again, there's a lot of different, there's a fair amount of frameworks out there, but kind of the best framework that's most folks point to, and for a lot of these tools, right, is going to be centric to PTEFs, right? So that's a purple teaming exercise framework. Now, of some of these tools I kind of have listed here, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about Caldera as a deep dive, right? So Caldera is, well, again, one of my more favorite tools I've discussed a couple times on some of these webinars. And MITRE Caldera is an open source platform for performing, yes, red teaming, but also purple teaming engagements, where you can see, you run some type of atomic test on what looks like a workstation or a server being compromised, and did you pick that up, right? And being able to see those artifacts in real time, right? What's really, really great about Caldera, though, is that Caldera is jam-packed with a ton of functionality when it comes to being able to select different advanced persistent threats profiles. So we want to emulate this type of adversary that is more specifically focused like on our industry. Maybe they're very focused on like attacking, let's say, I'm a semiconductor manufacturer, right? And this, ATP that's known in the wild, right, is very well known to target semiconductor manufacturers and other critical suppliers. Okay, cool. So MITRE Caldera has a lot of profiles on adversaries. You could essentially match up, say, okay, so this is the adversary I want to kind of emulate, right? It's kind of realistic in the same types of general TTPs that real adversary would use, right? And then running that across a set of hosts. Now, when you go to run those exercises, generally speaking, I recommend having a small environment that's kind of like a simulacrum, right? of like production, right? Or what the corporate environment would look like. So, hey, we have, this ratio of Windows servers, this ratio of Linux servers, this ratio, this type of network infrastructure that's by Palo Alto or Fortinet or Cisco or whatever, right? And we have a small mini environment, right, in which we can then deploy MITRE Caldera to, or our purple teaming tools to, right? And we can run these tests, right, essentially on a regular basis, like daily basis, right? And then when we see, okay, we failed this test emulating a malicious actor, right, who is, I don't know, let's say using Mimikatz, right? Using Mimikatz on a Windows server to pull off NTLM hashes that have been cached on that server. Okay, cool. So on that Windows server, let's deploy this blue team tool here, or let's tweak our EDR here. And does our EDR pick it up now? Run the test again. It looks like the EDR picked that up and blocked it, right? And MITRE Caldera knows that it's been blocked because the artifacts that it goes to generate, there might be sitting on the file system, or as a running process, are not there. Ergo, it wasn't able to accomplish its task, right? And you can see essentially these operations play out in real time. So it shows you, every date timestamp and on what systems, and being able to emulate that very thoroughly. So it's really, really cool, right? But that's, again, by far not the only purple team kind of tool or resource out there. Definitely Infection Monkey is another really, really popular one for folks. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't call out the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And the reason why I note that is because while many people at this juncture in cybersecurity are familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, I think that sometimes it can kind of be forgotten of what its function really is. It is not the equivalent of saying, like, this is an OWASP top 10 category, or this is a CWE category. Really, what we're trying to do with the MITRE ATT&CK framework is, rather than focusing on vulnerabilities and weaknesses that might be just through the lens of, again, having a CWE number applied to it, or a CVSS score applied to a vulnerability or weakness, is really understanding, where does that vulnerability and weakness exist, right, when it comes to the defense and depth posture of our organization. And if it got exploited, at what part of that is like a part of the kill chain of a malicious actor, right? Is that a couple layers deep, right? Is that towards more of the perimeter, right? And that allows us to then say, okay, so these vulnerabilities and weaknesses here, right, can be exploited by, these types of tools, right? They're going to be, at this layer of the kill chain, right, of a malicious actor attempting these things. And, right, we can kind of see what types of advanced persistent threats that are out there that target like our industry, our types of business, our size, and all that kind of stuff. Like, is this a vulnerability and weakness from a TTP standpoint that's highly targeted by malicious actors that focus on us? If it is, we should prioritize that in our risk remediation process much sooner, right, than something else, right? But the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which also works in conjunction with another framework called the MITRE Defend framework, allow us to use that same context and with our purple teaming tools, right? So like MITRE Caldera and that type of stuff, right? So we're more focused on what's the practical risk posture of the organization. It's truly exploitable by malicious actors. What's the real actual impact? What's the true likelihood, rather than synthetic kind of like scores and numbers and that type of stuff, right? And so almost a fair majority of the purple teaming frameworks and tools that are out there are one way or another lining to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which again focuses on those adversary behaviors, right? Some things that I'd be remiss if I didn't call out, by the way, just as I kind of talked to people over the years about the MITRE ATT&CK framework and in conjunction with purple teaming, right, is that not all techniques, right, not all TTPs and all that kind of stuff, right, are equal. Again, it kind of depends on where it is within the kill chain, right, what type of adversaries you might be dealing with in your specific like industry and at your specific size, right? And then also like the resources that it might take, right, to remediate the vulnerabilities and weaknesses that are associated with that particular TTP, right? there's also not like necessarily one way to say that like every TTP, right, is covered as like on or offs, right? So most of the times when people are doing purple teaming engagements, you're staging up your scenarios of like what are the realistic scenarios that we're going to be emulating, what tools are we going to be using, what types of TTPs are we going to be generating in that process, and by association, indicators of compromise and indicators of attack, right? But you don't necessarily like pass fail every category easily, right? Because you also have to just remember that that's for that particular scenario exercise that might be only applied to like, you know, Windows workstations rather than Mac OS workstations, or Windows servers versus Linux servers. So it's always just important to keep that in mind, right? And that also at the end of the day, the modern attack framework in itself, right, is a very much evolving resource. So it's not like a silver bullet. That doesn't mean that there aren't necessarily some level of new TTPs that threat actors might be leveraging that are not really well documented in there yet, right? There's consistently new evolving techniques that malicious actors will leverage to gain a foothold into organizations, most particularly one of the ones that we were just covering on a webinar a couple of weeks ago was rather than focusing on social engineering employees, malicious actors are now starting to figure out social engineering people's like co-pilot agents that might be reading your email, right, and helping you summarize your email, and that is also an attack vector, right, and getting a foothold into the organization and all that type of stuff. That being said, again, there are a number of commercial purple teaming tools and solutions and offerings out there. This webinar is not about covering the commercial offerings that are in the marketplace, even though there's a lot of really interesting and compelling ones. And one of the things I'd also be remiss if I didn't communicate is that purple teaming is not something that's a one and done thing, right? This is very much about a continuous process, right? And so really when we do these exercises, we start with things that are most practical that we're seeing in, real world attacks that are being kind of attempted against the organization. And then what we should do is then continue to expand the coverage, right, of various attack scenarios that might apply to the organization, right? And then also come back to previous scenarios and test the efficacy of those controls again. And the reason being is that malicious actors are constantly evolving, right? Their tactics, techniques, and procedures, right? And there can also be accidental regressions in the cybersecurity program in one way or another, be it if it's, for example, like some tooling is no longer functioning as expected on a set of endpoints or something like that, or the organization has since moved to a new type of tool that's doesn't actually have the same level of coverage as maybe the previous, like, I don't know, EDR solution, that type of stuff. So I would say, generally speaking, for organizations that are looking at being serious about purple team testing, that quarterly test cycles are kind of usually the best, probably more often than that from a manual perspective starts to become really human intensive, right? But probably less often than that from a manual perspective, you start to kind of lose a good snapshot of what's the security state and maturity level of the organization and its incident response capabilities, right? So there's kind of always that balance. Of course, using some of the more automated tools that I was just talking about a moment ago, like Leonidas, those would be more specifically done for a product or a specific platform or ecosystem. And then you would usually want to kind of conduct that type of purple teaming exercise on like every like a major release, that type of stuff. So that being said, I hope that this has been an informative exercise for folks to understand the power of purple teaming, and hopefully effectuate some change for you guys to look at how to improve the organization's security posture beyond just pen test vulnerabilities and weaknesses that are being exploited, but more focusing on what's the full maturity level of the incident response program for the organization and how it can improve its capabilities in that domain. And definitely stay tuned for some of the upcoming webinars that we have coming up next year. Next one being on continuous penetration testing and some of the great insights with that. Thank you so much. Bye now.